The woman's plea is a ragged whisper, lost in the howl of the wind that scours the high peaks. "In me, quickly," she begs, her body a broken line in the snow before his cabin. Elias Thorne stands over her, the biting wind tearing at his worn coat, his world of deliberate solitude shattered by her sudden appearance. She is feverish, delirious, one hand clutching her side as if to hold herself together. He assumes a wound, a gut shot from the look of her, festering beneath the layers of her tattered dress. A quick death might be the only mercy left. He needs to see the damage, to know if her plea is born of desperation or grim reality. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. He kneels, his bad leg protesting the cold with a familiar, searing ache. With a pragmatism honed by war and isolation, he reaches for the hem of her frozen dress. The fabric is stiff, resisting his touch. He lifts it just enough to see the source of her pain, his mind bracing for the sight of blood and torn flesh. But there is no wound. Instead, seared into the pale skin of her hip, is a brand. It's an ornate C, a cattle brand, burned into her as if she were livestock. His hand froze, not on a wound, but on the raised, seared flesh of a mark that spoke of ownership, cruelty, and a fate far worse than a simple bullet. He had carried her inside, her weight a fragile burden against his own solid frame. The cabin was his sanctuary, a small, sturdy defense against the world he had left behind after Shiloh. The war had taken a piece of his leg and a larger piece of his soul, and he had come to these unforgiving mountains to live with the silence. Now, that silence was filled with the woman's shallow, fevered breaths as she lay on his cot, wrapped in his only spare wool blanket. For 3 days, he tended to her. He melted snow for water, forcing it between her cracked lips with a spoon. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever, the same remedy he used when the ghosts of the battlefield kept him awake. He watched the brand on her hip, a symbol of profound injustice that stirred something dormant within him. It was the mark of Silas Croft, a cattle baron whose land spread through the valley below like a blight. Croft was a man known for his wealth, his power, and a cruelty that was spoken of only in whispers. Elias had heard the stories in his rare trips to the settlement for salt and flour. Tales of ranch hands who disappeared, of families run off their land, of a man who believed the world and everything in it belonged to him. This woman, it seemed, was one of his possessions. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity on the battlefield, the casual disregard for life that turned good men into monsters. He had thought he was done with all that, content to wage his wars against the winter and his own memories. But looking at the brutal sigil on the unconscious woman's skin, he felt the old, familiar weight of duty settle upon him. It was a feeling he had tried to outrun all the way to this lonely peak. On the 4th day, her fever broke. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fluttered open and fixed on him. Fear, raw and absolute, seized her. She scrambled backward on the cot, pulling the blanket to her chin like a shield, her body tense with the expectation of violence. He saw the terror in her gaze and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. He simply placed a bowl of thin broth on the small crate beside the cot and retreated to the other side of the one-room cabin, giving her space. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe here." She watched him, her eyes tracking his every move, her silence a wall he could not breach. He didn't press. He understood that words were cheap, especially to someone who had clearly known a world where they were used as weapons. Safety was not a promise, it was an action, and so he acted. He cleaned his rifle, mended a tear in his coat, and moved with a quiet purpose that was meant to be reassuring. He was a soldier, and in the absence of orders, he created a routine. The next morning, while he was outside splitting wood, she tried to flee. He found her 50 yards from the cabin, collapsed in the snow, her strength completely spent. He lifted her again, the frustration in him warring with a deep, aching pity. He carried her back inside and set her down more firmly this time. "The next time you try that, the wolves will find you before I do," he said, his tone harsher than he intended. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and despair. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. "He'll find me. And when he does, he'll hurt you for helping me." "Let him try," Elias said, the words simple and flat. He looked at her, truly looked at the gaunt planes of her face, the haunted depths of her eyes. "You stay? You heal. You can work for your keep. The roof and the food aren't free." He offered the words like a business transaction, a way to give her dignity, to erase the idea that she was a charity case or, worse, a prisoner. It was a contract, a new arrangement to replace the one seared into her skin. She stared at him, a flicker of disbelief in her expression. After a long moment, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The pact was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared glance in the quiet isolation of the mountain cabin. Her name, he would learn days later, was Alara, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she had a choice. The days bled into weeks, marked by the rising and setting of a cold, indifferent sun. A fragile rhythm established itself within the four walls of the cabin. Alara, true to their bargain, began to contribute. At first, her movements were hesitant, her body still weak and her spirit shrouded in caution. She would mend his worn shirts with small, neat stitches, her head bent low, as if afraid to be seen. She cleaned the cabin with a quiet efficiency, bringing a semblance of order to his Spartan existence. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye. He taught her, through gesture more than words, the essential skills of his world. He showed her how to set a snare for rabbits, his large, scarred hands guiding her smaller ones until she could tie the knot herself. He taught her how to bank the fire at night so a few embers would remain by morning, and how to read the clouds for an approaching storm. She was a quick learner, her focus intense, as if each new skill was another brick in the wall she was building around herself. Trust was not spoken of, it was earned in the shared silence. It was in the way she no longer flinched when he passed her a tin plate of food. It was in the way he started leaving his hunting knife on the table instead of keeping it on his belt. They learned the contours of each other's sorrows without ever asking. She saw the pain in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the way he would rub his thigh where the mini ball had shattered the bone, a constant reminder of a life he could no longer lead. He saw the shadow that passed over her face at any sudden noise, the way her hands would clench at her sides, her knuckles white. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, sealing them in their tiny refuge, she spoke. "You were a soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, staring into the fire. "A long time ago. Does it ever go away?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The memory of it." Elias was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the flames and the shriek of the wind. "No," he said finally. "You just make room for it. Find something else to put alongside it." It was the most he had spoken of his past, and the most she had ever dared to ask. The conversation ended there, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer just a shared shelter, but a shared understanding of what it meant to be haunted. The first real threat to their fragile peace came with the thaw. A fur trapper, a grizzled man named Jedediah, was making his way down from his high country lines and stopped at Elias's cabin, drawn by the smoke from his chimney. The moment Jedediah's horse came into view, Alara vanished into the small lean-to where Elias stored his supplies, pulling a heavy canvas over herself. Elias greeted the man with his usual gruff stoicism. They shared a cup of coffee, and Jedediah, starved for conversation, talked endlessly. He spoke of a poor season for beaver, of the coming spring, and then of the news from the valley. "Silas Crofts in a fearsome rage," Jedediah said, blowing on his steaming cup, "offering a hefty reward for some runaway servant girl. Got his men riding all over creation looking for her. Says she's a thief. Branded and all, so she'll be easy to spot." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Poor girl. I'd sooner face a grizzly than be dragged back to that man." Elias's expression remained unchanged, his face a mask of stone. He offered no comment, just a noncommittal grunt. But inside, a cold dread settled in his gut. The whispers had found their way up the mountain. The threat was no longer a phantom. It had a name and a price. After the trapper left, Elias found Alara still huddled in the lean-to, shivering. It wasn't from the cold. He helped her up, his touch on her arm meant to be steadying. "He's gone," he said. "For how long?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a renewed terror. They know. They're looking. The sanctuary he had provided felt suddenly, terribly vulnerable. The peace they had built was as fragile as a pane of ice. He looked out towards the vast, sprawling valley below, the direction Jedediah had gone. He could see, in his mind's eye, the riders spreading out, their search methodical, relentless. Croft was a man who did not tolerate losing what he considered his. Elias knew that his quiet life was over. The war he had tried to flee had followed him home. The sighting of the lone rider on the distant ridge confirmed their fears. He moved with a purpose that was not that of a hunter or a prospector. He was scanning the mountainside, his silhouette a dark promise of the coming storm. Elias watched him through his field glass, a relic from his army days, and felt the old instincts sharpen. He was assessing terrain, calculating distances, planning a defense. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. The comfortable silence had been replaced by a taut watchfulness. Every snap of a twig outside, every hoot of an owl, made Alara jump. Elias saw her fear and knew a decision had to be made. They could run, but Croft's reach was long, and Alara was not yet strong enough for a hard journey. Or they could stay. They could make a stand. He sat across from her at the small, rough-hewn table, the lantern casting long shadows on the log walls. "Alara," he began, his voice low and steady. "I won't let him take you. But you have to tell me everything. I need to know what we're up against." Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, the story came pouring out of her, a torrent of quiet misery. She had been an orphan, sent west as part of a church program, and had ended up indentured to Silas Croft to pay for her passage. He was a pillar of the community in public, but a monster in private. The brand wasn't for thievery. It was his mark of ownership, given to any servant who displeased him. She had displeased him by refusing his advances, by rejecting his foul propositions. Her defiance had earned her the hot iron and the promise of a public whipping to break her spirit. She had run that night, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terror that gave her strength. "He told me I was his property," she finished, her voice choked with shame and rage. "That no one would ever believe me over him. He said the brand was so everyone would know what I was." Elias listened, his jaw tight, a cold fury building inside him. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a sickness in his stomach. He had fought a war, bled for a cause he believed in, to ensure men were free. To see this woman treated as less than human, as an object to be owned and used, desecrated everything he had ever stood for. He stood up and walked to the wall where his rifle rested on 2 wooden pegs. He took it down, his movements deliberate. He checked the action, his hands sure and familiar with the weapon. "He's wrong," Elias said, his voice a low growl. He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers across the small room. "This is your home now. We will defend it." A profound change came over Alara. The fear in her eyes did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, a spark of defiance, a glimmer of hope. She stood and came to his side. "I don't know how to shoot," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "You can learn," he replied. "But for now, you can load." The soldier had his orders. The runaway had found her foxhole. They spent the next day preparing for the siege. Elias showed her how to measure powder and seat the lead balls for his pistol and rifle. He barricaded the one small window with thick planks, leaving only a narrow slit to shoot through. They were a team, moving with a synchronized purpose born of necessity. He was no longer just her protector. He was her commanding officer. And she was no longer a victim. She was a soldier in her own right, fighting for the only thing she had left, her freedom. As dusk fell, they sat in the dim light of the cabin, the weapons loaded and ready, and waited. They came 2 days later, 3 of them, riding up the trail as if they owned the mountain itself. Elias watched their approach from the narrow slit in the window. The man in the lead was broad and brutish, a man named Harker who served as Croft's enforcer. His reputation was as ugly as his face. "They're here," Elias said softly. Alara, who was stationed by the hearth with the powder horn and ammunition, simply nodded. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. Harker reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin door. "Thorn," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the still mountain air. "We know she's in there. Croft wants his property back. Send out the thieving girl, and we'll leave you be." Elias took a deep breath. He opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the small porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, its barrel pointed at the ground. He stood straight, his bad leg locked, a lone sentinel against the encroaching darkness. "There's no property here," Elias called back, his voice calm and clear. "Only a free woman. You're trespassing. Turn around and ride back down." Harker let out a coarse laugh. "A free woman? That branded whore? She belongs to Silas Croft, and he sent us to collect her." He spat on the ground. "Now, are you going to give her up easy, or do we have to burn you out?" As he spoke, the cabin door creaked open further. Alara stepped out to stand in the doorway behind Elias. She didn't cower. She didn't hide. She stood tall, her chin up, her eyes fixed on Harker with a look of pure, unadulterated defiance. Her presence was her answer. Harker's sneer faltered for a second, surprised by her courage. Then his face twisted in rage. "You'll regret that, girl." He started to reach for the pistol on his hip. He never cleared the leather. Elias's rifle came up in a single, fluid motion. The crack of the shot was sharp and final, a punctuation mark at the end of Harker's threat. The enforcer grunted, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before toppling sideways from his saddle into the dirt. The other two riders stared, their bravado vanishing with their leader's life. They were bullies and thugs, not soldiers. They looked from their fallen boss to the grim, unmoving figure on the porch. "Take him," Elias said, his voice cold as iron, "and ride back to your master. You tell Silas Croft that Alara Thorne is under my protection. Tell him if he sends anyone else up this mountain, they'll be buried on it." He used his own name for her. In that single moment, he claimed her, not as property, but as family. He erased Croft's brand with a name, a declaration of belonging that was freely given and bravely earned. The two riders, spurred by fear, scrambled to retrieve Harker's body. They slung him over his horse and fled back down the trail, not daring to look back. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. The immediate threat was gone. Elias lowered the rifle, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. He turned to Alara. The adrenaline was leaving them both, their bodies trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror, relief, and something new, something he had never seen in them before. She stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. For the first time, she reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. Her touch was not one of need or fear, but of profound, grounding solidarity. It was the touch of an equal, a partner. He looked down at her hand, then back to her face, and saw the future in her steady gaze. They went back inside the cabin. The space no longer felt like his solitary shelter, but their shared home, a fortress they had defended together. The ugly brand was still a part of her story, a scar she would always carry. But as he watched her move to the hearth, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the fire, he knew it no longer defined her. He had offered a roof to a desperate fugitive. In return, she had given his lonely existence a purpose, a reason to fight. The war was over, a new life was just beginning. He watches her hum as she mends his shirt by the firelight, and knows he'd done more than shelter a runaway. He'd found his heart. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.